One particularly interesting and also rather droll aspect of Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik are what he calls the homeostatic machines, using an earlier terminology. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. And they're not really that central to the plot. They don't take up the role of actual characters, but they're part of the world building of the, interestingly, the 1990s, which is our past, but Dick's future, of this novel. And so homeostatic, right? Homeostasis is a concept that we typically think of in terms of living things, biological entities, but it's also applied to mechanical entities as well. So for example, your thermostat tries to attain a certain kind of homeostasis. It's registering the temperature. It gets above that in the case of air conditioning, and the air conditioning goes on, right? And if you've got it also connected up with your heat, it goes below a certain level, the heat goes on. And then when it gets warm enough, it responds to its environment and it says, okay, let's turn the heat off. And you could have this set up in all sorts of more and more complex ways. And Dick doesn't actually have just that in mind, because what we see is that the individual machines, at least some of them, have a kind of consciousness. They not only interact with whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing for you. So a door would open up, or a coffee machine would make coffee, or a paper creating machine would print out papers for you to look at. They're also responsive to the person who they're doing it for, and they will not only interact with them, but show a kind of self-awareness, and we might even say, in some respects, a strategic kind of thinking as well. So there's a lot of individual machines that are, refusing to do things, bargaining, talking with the main character, Joe Chip. And it's been suggested that Philip K. Dick is somebody who is coming up with what we nowadays call the Internet of Things. And so if you're not familiar with that term, what is the Internet of Things? It's an idea that we would have all of these networked devices, say within a home. So your Alexa, if you're using Amazon, or your Siri, if you're using Apple or Google, whatever it happens to be, would be communicating with, say, your refrigerator or your coffee pot, or pick anything else that you want, your smart TV. And all these devices would be, using, generally, we would say, Wi-Fi, and talking with each other and gathering information and, suiting themselves to what your preferences are. And is that exactly what Dick is sketching out? No, it's not quite like that. There's no idea that there's some single or multiple tech corporations that are handling this, for one thing. And it doesn't seem like the machines are particularly interested in communicating with each other within the environment. They're interested in interacting with their user, but they do have a network of sorts, because we see some of the machines talking about what a, bad credit risk, for example, Joe Chip is. So it's not exactly the Internet of Things, but it's analogous to it. It's, sort of a fictional precursor of it. The other thing that's really kind of funny about this, so in the Internet of Things of today, They're constantly gathering data on you. You don't get the idea that these machines particularly care to do that sort of thing. What they are really interested in is getting paid for things. They're going to charge you for the services that they provide, and these are not optional, as we're going to see Joe Chip getting into a discussion about later with his door. So in Joe Chip's apartment, in chapter 3, we have a number of different machines that the narration tells us about, and the very first one is the pape machine, right? So we read this: Joe Chip lit a cigarette after inserting a dime, twiddled the dial of his recently rented pape machine. Having a hangover, he dialed off interplanetary news, hovered momentarily at domestic news, then selected gossip. Yes, sir, the pape machine said heartily. Now, so notice, heartily, right? It can have sort of attitudes that it can display. Gossip. Guess what Stanton Mick, the reclusive, interplanetarily known speculator and financier, is up to at this very moment? Its works whizzed in a scroll of printed paper matter crept from its slot. The ejected roll, a document in 4 colors, niftily incised with bold type, rolled across the surface of the neoteakwood table and bounced to the floor. Joe Chip retrieved it, spread it out flat before him, and it's this article about Stanton Mick, right? And he says, oh, this isn't gossip. This is speculation about fiscal transactions. Today I want to read about which TV star is sleeping with whose drug-addicted wife. And so the machine says, oh, okay, well, set the dial for low gossip. So it's actually telling him how to input the right kind of information or settings for that. And it's going to give him, another thing about this caricature of Lola Herzberg, right? And he's going to read about that. So that's one interesting thing. And then we have the ring mechanism for the door. We'll come to the door in just a moment happening. And Joe is getting a visit. And he's like, oh, crap, I got to get this place cleaned up, right? He says, give me 15 minutes. And what does he do? He's going to, we'll talk about coffee in just a moment. He calls and he dials 214, the extension for the maintenance circuit of the building, right? So there's another machine. Listen, he said when the homeostatic entity answered, I'm now in a position to divert some of my funds in the direction of settling up my bill vis-a-vis your cleanup robots. He wants some robots to come in and tidy up his place so he doesn't look like a complete slob when the prospect and the scout come in. Now, it's going to turn out, we'll talk about this in just a bit, they're not going to let him do that. He does make coffee. He inserts a dime into his coffee pot. And it turns out he bought some coffee, which is very expensive, right? So he searches the cupboards of the kitchen. He couldn't find any of that sort of stuff. And he instead makes himself some coffee, right? And the coffee will be pretty good because it is actually, a machine that does its job. Then we get the door, and he wants to open the door, and the door says, you've got to give me 5 cents. And he's searching, he doesn't have any more coins, and he is going to get into a bit of an argument with the door, which we'll look at momentarily. So he tells the guy on the other side, Ashwood, hey, put in a nickel, the mechanism is jammed over here. They do that, and they get out. So once everybody's in the apartment, and we have Pat Connolly there. She is going to ask about taking a shower, and he says, that costs $0.25. I don't have $0.25. And she's talking about living at a kibbutz where everything is free, and they have a discussion about that, right? All the machines are going to let you do things because there's a central economy. And he says, well, if you want to take a shower, it's going to cost you. It may be that's what the bathroom is talking about a little bit later on, but it's not entirely clear. Then we get him going to his refrigerator, and the refrigerator charges you money to open it up and get stuff out to eat, right? So we've got this very interesting economic penetration of the household where you're constantly paying out little bits of money here and there, like microtransactions, we would call them, right? For using the intelligent machines that have been set up in your place. And we find at the very end of the chapter, Pat Conley, who's got a whole bunch of coins along with her, she's going to say, when can I move my things in here? I consider it mine as of now, since I've already paid you what must be virtually the entire month's rent. Anytime, he said. And then the bathroom tells her, 50 cents, please, before turning on the water. And she goes back into the kitchen to get her purse, right? So we've gotten to see in chapter 3 a whole host of different homeostatic machines that are looking for payment, and they'll do a good job if you provide that payment. Otherwise, they're not going to do that. They will, however, talk with you. So that's where we get to this very interesting observation about Joe Chip's credit. This is a trait of him that he's no good at managing money, right? So the door is going to have an argument with him about whether it will open up. So we read, he tells the door, I'll pay you tomorrow. He tried the knob. Again, it locked tight. What I pay you is in the nature of a gratuity. I don't have to pay you. Now, notice what the door says. I think otherwise. The door said, look in the purchase contract you signed when you bought this Conapt. In his desk drawer, he found the contracts, and signing it, he'd found it necessary to refer to the document many times. Sure enough, payment to his door for opening and shutting constituted a mandatory fee, not a tip. So going back to the issue of the consciousness, this is a door that actually knows the deal, so to speak, right? It understands its purpose. It understands the difference between a gratuity or tip and a mandatory fee. It won't extend him credit, in part because it knows that he's not very good with money. So what does Joe do? He gets out a stainless steel knife and he begins to unscrew the bolt assembly of his apartment's money-gulping door. And the door says, I'll sue you, as the first screw fell out. Joe Chip says, I've never been sued by a door, but I guess I can live through it. What can the door possibly take? And notice the door is talking about making legal recourse to remedies. So, again, fairly sophisticated consciousness. He also has this interesting discussion about the possibility of, credit being extended. So, when he calls to get the robots in, the maintenance circuit says, you're going to have to pay your full and entire bill before they start. By now, he had his billfold in hand. From it, he dumped his supply of magic credit keys, most of which by now had been voided, probably in perpetuity, his relationship with money and the payment of pressing debts being such as it is. Now, here's what he proposes. I'll charge my overdue bill against my triangular magic key. That will transfer the obligation out of your jurisdiction. On your books, it'll show as total restitution. And then the maintenance circuit says, plus fines, plus penalties. And he says, I'll charge those against my heart-shaped. And then we read this. Mr. Chip, the Ferris and Brockman Retail Credit Auditing and Analysis Agency has published a special flyer on you. Our receipt slot received it yesterday, and it remains fresh in our minds. Since July, you've dropped from a triple G status credit-wise to quadruple G. That's probably as bad as it can possibly go. Our department, in fact, this entire Conapt building is now programmed against an extension of services and or credit to such pathetic anomalies as yourself, sir. Regarding you, everything must be hereafter handled on a basic cash subfloor. In fact, you'll probably be on a basic cash subfloor for the rest of your life. In fact, Joe hangs up the phone at that point. So notice, it's not just saying, hey, we're not going to extend you credit. It's basically saying, you, sir, are a deadbeat. You are a degenerate. It's casting judgment upon him, and a moral judgment, you could say, right? So that's pretty interesting. And it's telling him, you are probably going to be at this basic cash subfloor, meaning you have to pay for everything up front through cash. No more credit for you. There's a few other interesting references that we're going to get at different points in later chapters, and I just want to bring those up. So when all of the inertials with the Runcitor associates are going up to the moon to meet with Stanton Mick, they are taken into a place, and each of them has a bedroom, and Miss Wirt says, to start you off, she produced a large plastic bag. Here's a complimentary supply of coins. She handed the rolls of dimes, nickels, and quarters to John Ild. Would you distribute these equally? A gesture of goodwill by Mr. Mick, right? So this is a way of like saying, hey, this will make you comfortable. Because in order to use the machines, you got to have coins. We also see this happening to some degree at the hotel that Joe is going to stay in, but some things are complementary, like the pape machine. Later on in chapter 10, as we see things beginning to go back in time, to revert to some earlier version of themselves, there's one thing that doesn't change, right? He says he realizes that he's going to have to leave his apartment, and when he tries to open the door, the front door says, 5 cents, please. One thing, anyhow, hadn't changed. The toll door had an innate stubbornness to it. Probably it would hold out after everything else, after everything accepted had long since reverted, perhaps in the whole city, if not in the whole world. So he pays it, walks out, and that's that. So very interesting feature of the world that Philip K. Dick is sketching for us, that all of these people are living in, dominated by machines that do serve human beings, but really, can be quite caustic and judgmental and always demand their due one way or another.